Chains and Images of Psychological Slavery by Akbar, PhD, clinical psychologist. Copyright 1984. Dedicated to the faith of our ancestors and the mercy of Allah. Introduction. Slavery is the modern genesis experience for Africans in the Western world. Contained in this genesis is much about the continued social, economic, political, and cultural reality of African Americans. There is contained in this tragic drama the nucleus of a mind wrought with the agonies of oppression of the most inhuman form, and simultaneously the image of man's greatest triumph over conditions of the flesh. There is a certain hesitation about dwelling on events of the past. On the one hand, it creates an atmosphere of determinism which removes the volitional possibilities of people to alter their condition. It tends to excuse the perpetuation of past events which could be altered simply by initiative. It preoccupies people unnecessarily and purposely with old hurts, tending old wounds. It is an emotional tirade that ultimately provides no constructive solutions for the present. But those who deny the lessons of the past are doomed to repeat it. Those who fail to recognize that the past is a shaper of the present, and the hand of yesterday continues to write on the slate of today, leave themselves vulnerable by not realizing the impact of influences which do serve to shape their lives. The shadow slavery of Africans in America for over 300 years serves as one of the saddest commentaries on man's inhumanity to man. The tales of this period of our history are so morbid that they will arouse vehement hostilities at the very thought of what occurred. The level of cruelty was incomparable to anything recorded in modern history, including the Nazi atrocities at Auschwitz, which were fleeting and direct, destroying bodies, but essentially leaving the collective mind intact. The protracted and intensive atrocities of slavery have had a lingering effect, and the pain of times past continues to call out from the genetic memories of those whose ancestors survived the test of slavery. As cruel and painful as chattel slavery was, it could be exceeded only by a worse form of slavery. This worse form of slavery, along with the chattel slavery, is the subject of these two essays. The slavery that captures the mind and incarcerates the motivation, perception, aspiration, and identity in a web of anti-self images, generating a personal and collective self-destruction, is more cruel than the shackles on the wrists and ankles. The slavery that feeds on the psychology, invading the soul of man, destroying his loyalties to himself, and establishing allegiance to forces which destroy him, is an even worse form of capture. The influences that permit an illusion of freedom, liberation, and self-determination, while tenaciously holding one's mind in subjugation, is the folly of only the sadistic. Imam Muhammad, the prominent African American Muslim leader, has brought an interesting new twist for religion for African Americans during his leadership over the last 8-9 years. This new twist is an interpretive analysis of religion and social process based upon the religious doctrine of the Holy Quran. This is a new twist, not in the application of the Quran, because its use is nearly 70 years old in its influence in African American communities. What is new is an intellectual and rational analysis of religion and its meaning, as opposed to the persisting emotionalism which has characterized religious appeal of African American leadership. This is not to say that we have not had religious scholars. On the contrary, we have had some of the most outstanding religious scholars. The problem is that the scholars have only talked to each other, and the masses of the people have only received the fervor and ritual of the religious meaning. Imam Muhammad has brought the exegesis and social commentary out of the seminaries into the streets, and in doing so has harnessed a new religious psychology in the African American community. Based upon the questions which he has raised among the members of his religious movement, questions have had to be raised and answered throughout the Islamic and Christian communities in general, and particularly in the African American communities. The important factor is that the questions have not been confined to the religious sector, but have penetrated into the entire social, academic, political, and economic sphere. Several of these penetrating issues have been addressed in 3 previous collections of essays, which I have done since 1976. This booklet takes up 2 other such issues which have been stimulated by my study of Imam Muhammad's lectures and writings. His own manuscripts have well demonstrated that he does not need an interpreter in order to transform his verbal statements into literal ones. He has aptly presented and extrapolated from his own ideas. I am neither a spokesman nor an interpreter of the work of Imam Muhammad. I am a devoted student of truth, and I recognize him as a sincere teacher, and one inspired by the Creator and the tradition of many inspired teachers throughout the world. The efforts of this discussion, and the ones which have been produced before, are not intended to quote-unquote parrot Mr. Muhammad's ideas, but to apply my grasp of his ideas to my research and study of the human mind and soul. He has served as a catalyst for many of my ideas, and he has certainly facilitated the crystallization of many of those ideas into meaningful concepts. But I must take full responsibility for any misrepresentations that may be made of his ideas. He certainly is not responsible in any way for my distortions. The integration of his ideas into those of many other great thinkers who have influenced my perceptions is also my responsibility. These essays are written with a hope that he will be complimented by my efforts, but by no means are they prepared under his specific instruction. The 2 ideas which are developed in these essays are the impact of slavery, generally as a continuing influence on the psychology of African Americans. Over the last 8 years, Imam Muhammad has frequently made references to the quote-unquote ghost of the plantation, which haunts the psychological and the social processes of African Americans. Stimulated by these comments, the first essay identifies some sample characteristics which are neither exhaustive nor necessarily more critical than some other possible traits, but are illustrative of the kind of connection which exists between the historical realities of slavery and the contemporary social psychology of African American communities. Throughout the essay, I caution against a simplistic, unidimensional analysis which would argue for a single psychohistorical analysis of African American characteristics which come out of a multiplicity of causes. In highlighting the slavery influences, we are demonstrating a distinct determinant of African American psychological functioning which makes us unique in some of the causative influences on our actions. We are also introducing a behavioral determinant which does not have great legitimacy in Western psychology, and that is the notion that individual behavior can be influenced by collective factors which are also historically remote. A full appreciation of the uniqueness of people can emerge from an appreciation of such factors. The commonality in people's responses to certain environmental influences can also be demonstrated by the same data. The second essay takes on a more theologically loaded issue, and that is the influence of racial religious imagery on the psychology of people. This discussion takes on the old iconoclastic arguments that have plagued the Christian church for centuries. The approach that we take is not theological. Though we are clear in the Quranic and biblical injunction against religious imagery, idols, etc., our argument is not an issue of religious law. Within the context of our discussion of the psychology of slavery, we are interested in identifying the enslaving potential of this religious imagery, particularly as it relates to the portrayal of the divine in the racial characteristics of a particular people. We approach this problem from the vantage point of the racial group that is portrayed, as well as its impact on the ones not portrayed. Our position is that the portrayal of the divine in the physical form of any people is a potentially damaging influence on the psychological and spiritual development of human beings. We thoroughly recognize the rationale and the value of utilizing such figures as a corrective agent by some African American religious groups. The fact that some people have chosen to retaliate in an affirmative fashion by depicting the heavenly host in black racial characteristics in contrast to the Caucasian racial features which have characterized our view of religious figures throughout our Western history represents a reasonable reaction. We commend those whose vision was broad enough to spot the destructive influence of these images on the psyches of non-white people. On the other hand, as we transcend the dimensions of emotional reaction and begin to contemplate rational initiative, we must also be cognizant of the deleterious effect of these religious images on the psychology of Caucasians, and be careful that we do not duplicate the same type of mania within our lives. There are other characteristics of these religious images which also have a profound influence on the psychology of people, which Imam Muhammad has discussed in his lectures and I have discussed in earlier essays. The focus of the discussion is specific, though, and deals directly with the impact of the racial features of the imagery and the impact on the racial identities of people who experience the imagery. These essays were based upon lectures which were presented in several contexts. The incentive for getting them transcribed into this literal form was a direct consequence of the persisting encouragement of Imam Armaya Numan of Numan Productions, who has remained an advocate for developing meaningful scholarly works. The specific efforts of his wife, Sister Zakaya Numan, made the job more accomplishable by doing the typing for the manuscripts. The whole thing would not have been possible had I not received a letter several months ago from a young man incarcerated in a Connecticut institution who offered his efforts to assist me in getting more materials out. I had explained to him the absence of financial and staff resources to get work done, and he indicated that he was willing to do whatever he could to assist me. I must admit some initial doubt, because many people offer but few deliver. I sent him some tapes, however, and was pleasantly surprised to receive completed transcripts back from him in a matter of days. This was the contribution of Adib Fahmi al-Hamed, to whom I owe a particular debt of appreciation. He stands as a symbol for the inability of walls to contain the determined spirits of true men. He also stands as another shining example of the power of al-Islam to transform the lives of human beings and to bridge worlds, both geographically and socially. We pray that Allah will continue to bless Adib F. Al-Hamed with great success to which he is aspiring. We are also hopeful that this publication will be a statement of gratitude to him, to the Numans, to Imam W.D. Muhammad, and to my wife Renee for her continued support in this and all of my efforts in this struggle to be a human being in spite of. Naeem Akbar, July 1st, 1983, Tallahassee, Florida. The psychological legacy of slavery. Slavery was quote unquote legally ended in excess of 100 years ago, but the over 300 years experienced in its brutality and unnaturalness constituted a severe psychological and social shock to the minds of African Americans. This shock was so destructive to natural life processes that the current generation of African Americans, though we are 5 or 6 generations removed from the actual experience of slavery, still carry the scars of this experience in both our social and mental lives. Psychologists and sociologists have failed to attend to the persistence of problems in our mental and social lives which clearly have their roots in slavery. Only the historian has given proper attention to the shattering realities of slavery, and he has dealt with it only as a descriptive of past events. Clark, 1972, observes that most social scientists would object to a discussion of slavery as a quote-unquote cause of contemporary behavior because it happened quote-unquote too long ago. Clark identifies the origin of this objection in 19th century conceptions of science articulated by the British philosophers Locke and Hume and practiced by the scientific giant Isaac Newton. Clark, 1972, observes, quote, "In the Newtonian scheme of things, a body at rest remains at rest unless acted upon by some external force. The behavior, movement of things was thought to be the consequence of some antecedent and external event. Newtonian conceptions of absolute time and space have so conditioned many of us that it is impossible for us to conceive of events that have occurred long in the past, e.g., slavery, as having as much effect in determining present behavior as those events of relatively recent occurrence." End quote. Clark, in this monumental piece, argues that slavery, more than any other single event, shaped the mentality of the present-day African American. In order to fully grasp the magnitude of our current problems, we must reopen the books on the events of slavery. Our objective should not be to cry still tears for the past, nor to rekindle old hatreds for past injustices. Instead, we should seek to enlighten our path of today by better understanding where and how the lights were turned out yesterday. We should also understand that slavery should be viewed as a starting point for understanding the African American psyche and not as an endpoint. Therefore, the study of the African American psyche should include psychohistory, but it should not be exclusively concerned with events in the past. The list of attitudes and reactions which we have inherited from slavery is probably quite extensive. We want to identify here only some of the more blatant and currently destructive attitudes which rather clearly show their origins in the slavery situation. Hopefully, a look at this tarnished legacy will serve as a stimulus for us to rid ourselves of these slavery ideas, both individually and collectively. Work. One of the attitudes which has been passed to us from slavery is the rather common African American attitude towards work. Slavery was forced labor. Kenneth Stamp, 1956, described the work of the slave as occurring, quote, from day clear to first dark, end quote. The day's toil would begin just before sunrise and would end at dusk. Stamp observed, quote, except for certain essential chores, Sunday work was uncommon, but not unheard of if the crops required it. On Saturdays, slaves were often permitted to quit the fields at noon. They were also given holidays, most commonly at Christmas and after crops were laid. End quote. Basically, however, work was a daily chore, beginning in early childhood and continuing until death or total disability. The slave was forced to work under the threat of abuse or even death, but the work was not for the purpose of providing for his life's need. Instead, he worked to produce for the slave master. He would neither profit from his labor nor enjoy the benefits of his labor. A good crop did not improve his life, his family, or his community. Instead, it improved the life and the community of the slave master. Work in a natural society is looked upon with pride, both because it permits a man to express himself and because it supplies his survival needs. As a natural form of expression, work is not too distinguishable from play. During slavery, work was used as a punishment. The need for workers was the most identifiable cause of the African Americans' enslavement. Work came to be despised as any punishment is despised. Work became hated as does any activity which accomplishes no reward for the doer. Work became identified with slavery. Even today, the African American slang expression which refers to a job as a quote-unquote slave communicates this painful connection. Through the course of the centuries, work came to be a most hated activity. Despite the fact that we are over 100 years removed from the direct slavery experience, the African American still, to a great extent, hates work. Work is identified with punishment. Work is equated with inferiority. Stamp 1956 also observes, quote, masters who had at their command as few as a half-dozen field hands were tempted to improve their social status by withdrawing from the fields and devoting most of their time to managerial functions. But most slaves never saw their masters toiling in the fields. End quote. Consequently, slaves equated work with enslavement and freedom with the avoidance of work. Work was identified as the activity of the underdog and was difficult to be viewed with pride. Work is something approached unwillingly and out of necessity only. It is also a badge of disparagement. Many African Americans have developed a variety of habits to avoid work, such as reliance upon gambling and other get-rich-quick schemes. Some of the difficulty that we experience in generating independent businesses and institutions is because of our hatred of work. It is still difficult to view the long-term reward of sustained work as being adequate to erase the stigma of such toil. It is much easier to work, often considerably harder, for someone else and get a predictable periodic salary and a work schedule which lets one create an illusion of leisure. Every Friday evening until Sunday becomes Emancipation Day all over again. Many African Americans become over-dependent on welfare as a way of life. This too can to an extent be related to the historical root of associating work with slavery. Certainly, the historical origin of the hatred of work does not completely explain the African Americans' orientation to work. Equally as relevant is the vast shortage of jobs and the many obstacles to receiving the same benefits from work as do other members of the society. Work is still geared toward community building for others and not for the African Americans. In addition, the society itself has developed such a leisure orientation that work has come to be something to be despised by all members of the society. It is important, however, for African Americans to know that many of our attitudes toward work are a result of our slavery experiences. These negative experiences associated with work continue to function as unconscious influences on us that make us respond in ways which may be contrary to our conscious intention. Awareness of these influences and their source begins to free us from their effects. Our slang, our songs, our jokes, our attitudes, transmitted from one generation to the next, preserve these reactions as if they were acquired yesterday. Property. The slave was permitted to own nothing or very little. Certainly, property and the finer material objects, such as clothes, jewelry, etc., were reserved for the slave master. Stamp 1956 again observes, quote, carelessness, indifference, and economy were the chief reasons why a large proportion of slaves wore shabby and insufficient apparel made from some variety of cheap Negro cloth. During the long summers, ragged and meager clothing merely added to the drabness of slave life, but during the winters it caused real discomfort and posed a serious threat to health. End quote. The slave master's fine house, beautiful landscaping, exquisite clothes, and objects were associated with his power and status. In the same way that the slave looked upon his master with hatred and resentment, he also resented and envied the master's possessions, because those possessions were associated with freedom and power to direct one's life, family, and community. African Americans have the slavery influence of mixed attitudes toward material objects and property. On one hand, those objects are still associated with the master's powers. Therefore, there is a tendency to resent property and to take a secret, unconscious delight in attacking it. Certainly, some of our tendencies toward vandalism and abuse of property have their origin in these experiences with property. Property is still viewed as belonging to the quote-unquote master and not to the slave. This finds additional expression when the African American is thrown into public housing and rented properties, which are in fact still owned by the descendants of the slave masters. Vandalism is unconsciously gratifying in that it acts out that long present resentment of the master's property. Given the persisting dependence on the quote-unquote master, it is safer to be neglectful of his property than overtly hostile towards him. On the other hand, slavery produced an unnatural attraction to material objects. The cast-off hat or dress passed down from the quote-unquote big house to the cabin became a symbol of pride and status. By wearing Massa's old hat or Mrs. old dress, one could play at being Massa or Mrs. for a few fanciful moments. An illustration of this idea dating back to slavery experiences also comes from Stamp 1956. Quote, the elegantly dressed slaves who promenaded the streets of southern towns and cities on Sundays, the men in fine linens and bright waistcoats, the women in full petticoats and silk gowns, were usually the domestic servants of wealthy planters or townspeople. Butlers, coachmen, maids, and valets had to uphold the prestige of their white families. End quote. These material objects or dregs of property became equated in the African American's thinking with the full power of freedom and self-determination which the master enjoyed. We can observe a similar pattern in our developing children who play at being mama and daddy by putting on objects of their clothing or other objects associated with them. The legacy of such experience with property and materials has made these objects powerfully influential in our lives. Large sums of money are thrown away yearly on expensive, flashy clothes and cars. Uncomfortable, impractical, and showy items of furniture drain our budgets and fail to satisfy our longings because of this persistent wish to look like the slave master. Many of our judgments about people and their worth are disproportionately determined by what those people own or wear. We spend great energy and wealth acquiring these objects associated with power rather than actual human, social, political, and economic power. There is a frequent tendency to confuse tokens of power with genuine power based upon the slavery experience. It is not unusual for concerted efforts to obtain quote unquote real political and economic power to be prematurely aborted by a strategic dispensation of tokens. Realistically assertive efforts to alter social structures to equitably accommodate America's former slaves have frequently been terminated by offering limited material goods to the major strategists, and the movement dies. The major thinkers and scholars, potentially our most powerful agents of change, in African American communities are often neutralized by a pittance of material goods. This socially destructive phenomena has its roots deep in the slavery experience. Too often, the leaders in our communities have equated a small trinket of material gain with quote unquote having arrived. That leadership is soon lost to the African American community. It is a recurrence of the old image of wearing massa's discarded hat and thinking that you are massa. It is important that we caution the reader in considering these ideas that we remember these factors are only one aspect of what determines our behavior. The destructiveness and violence in the society's present mentality fosters vandalism. The materialism which has overrun the Western mind certainly has had its effect on the African American mind. We simply want to be aware of the predispositions which operate from within us and from our past, which may control us in ways in which we do not realize. Leadership. Probably one of the most destructive influences which has grown out of slavery is the disrespect of African American leadership. The allegory is seen throughout nature that the most certain way to destroy life is to cut off the head. From the turkey to the cow to the man, the most immediate way to bring death to a body is to remove its head. This is especially true as a social principle. One of the things that was systematically done during slavery was the elimination of control of any emerging head or leader. Slave narratives and historical accounts are full of descriptions of atrocities brought against anyone who exemplified real leadership capacity. The slaveholders realized that their power and control over the slaves was dependent upon the absence of any indigenous leadership among the slaves. Any slave who began to emerge as a natural head, that is, one oriented towards survival of the whole body, was identified early and was either gotten rid of, isolated, killed, or ridiculed. In his place was put a leader who had been carefully picked, trained, and tested to stand only for master's welfare. In other words, unnatural heads were attached to the slave communities. They furthered the cause of the master and frustrated the cause of the slave. The slaves were taught to view with suspicion natural heads which emerged from among themselves. Such heads were identified as uppity or arrogant, and were branded as the kind of troublemakers who were destined to bring trouble to the entire slave community. This idea was reinforced by the public punishment of such indigenous leadership and any of his or her associates or sympathizers. The entire slave community was often required to carry an extra burden or deprived of some small privilege because of such uppity slaves. Such practices rather firmly entrenched the opposition of natural leaders. They were often isolated by their own community and were usually the victims of fellow slave snitches who reported to the master that someone was brewing trouble. The snitches, having demonstrated their loyalty to the master, were usually promoted to the position of slave leader, and another grafted leader was born, i.e., with a slave body and master's head. The slave community was encouraged to view the greater power given to the master-trained leader as an indication of his superior worth as a leader. The master-trained leader was rewarded, praised, and given privileges as an inducement for the slaves to follow his leadership. The long generations of being conditioned to reject natural and strong leadership has not only stifled the development of such leaders, but African Americans still respond by rejecting such leaders. Even outstanding leaders, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., were rejected and denied support by the African American educated and professional classes of people in many major cities. He was condemned in the early days of his civil rights campaigns as a quote-unquote troublemaker. Only after receiving recognition from increasing numbers of liberal Caucasians was he accepted as a leader. Powerful leaders who emerged from the ranks of the uneducated, such as Elijah Muhammad, never received wide acceptance, despite the fact that he offered the most powerful economic and self-help program of the time. Contemporary Negro history accounts devote extensive coverage to Muhammad's trainees, such as Malcolm Shabazz, while mentioning the natural head only in passing. Such rejection of strong African American leadership is as conditioned in us as is our fear and hatred of a burning cross. It is important to realize that such efforts to undermine effective African American leadership is still an ongoing part of the current society. The press, for example, fails to mention many of the outstanding accomplishments of indigenous African American leadership. On the other hand, the least important statement from a master-appointed leader gains front-page coverage. The other side of this issue of quote-unquote grafted leaders is that a realistically based suspiciousness of African American leadership grew in our communities. Forced to reject natural leadership in opposition to their survival instincts and to accept oppressor-appointed leadership compelled our communities to essentially suspect all leadership. This suspiciousness is manifested in a rather pervasive disrespect for black leaders, unless they come arrayed with a supply of token or mystical power. The token power usually comes in the form of a limousine, some ostentatious clothing, and some rather impressive jewelry. The mystical power requires identifying one's leadership as having some kind of divine legitimization. These leaders often gain considerable followings of an intensely emotional form. Otherwise, quote-unquote leaders are projected by the master's media and press, and are often chosen from illiterate athletes, politically naive preachers, or even entertainers. The leadership of such persons seldom extends beyond their faddish and transitory stardom. Meanwhile, all other forms of small scale and large scale leaders, indigenous and otherwise, are destroyed by suspiciousness and disrespect. As a people, African Americans must begin to recognize the disposition which has been conditioned in us to reject natural, effective leadership. If we understand that we have been programmed through our history to reject our natural heads, we may begin to become more conscious of recognizing true leaders. It can be easily demonstrated that the persistent distrust and limited support given to African American leaders has its origin in the many inappropriate heads which have been affixed to our bodies historically. The clown, another serious handicap which we inherited from slavery, is the African American clown. One of the primary forms of remaining in favor with the slave master by the slave was to provide entertainment for the master and his household. It is easy to observe that man exults in his superiority over lower animals by teaching them to do tricks and being entertained by those tricks. In much the same way, the slave owner prided himself in his superiority by being entertained by the slave. Writers have long pointed to the jester, the clown, or the fool as the inferior one who was responsible for making his superior laugh. Using a person for your clown has always been one of the major ways to assert your dominance over a person. Mockery is one of the more sophisticated forms of humiliation. Great favors of leniency and special rewards were given to the clowning slave. He enjoyed a special status above the other slaves because he kept his master entertained. Even the arts, music, and dance, which had originally been used for self-expression and community recreation, became devices which were used by the slave to protect himself from the master's anger. Fiddler, in the TV drama Roots, was a colorful example of this manipulative function of the clown. Clowning and buffoonery became one of the primary ways that the violent and abusive slave master could be controlled and manipulated. The problem with this pattern, as with the others we have discussed, is that this kind of response has long outlived its real usefulness. What began as a survival tactic under highly unnatural living conditions has become a crippling part of the psychology of a people seeking to restore life and community to themselves. An overwhelming number of popular media presentations involved African American clowns. Comedy is valuable unless it is done to the exclusion of aspects of other facets of a people's life. The clear underrepresentation of serious aspects of African American life in the popular media suggests that even the former slaves prefer to laugh about themselves rather than improve themselves. The bug-eyed JJ on the program Good Times is an update of the 1940s and 1950s Stepin Fetchit and Mantan Moreland. These clowns were updates on the slavery buffoon who mastered being funny to survive. This is not to degrade obvious talent of these master showmen, but to identify a force which has exalted the clown while degrading or ignoring the scientists. Entertainers and athletes are the popular heroes of the African American community. Physical prowess or comic exploit are the only characteristics black heroes are permitted to express. Intellectual acuity, prophetic vision, moral integrity, technological know how, and managerial efficiency are characteristics seldom, if ever, portrayed. Consequently, the slave images of power persist. African American children, as a consequence, strive to throw balls or croon on microphones rather than seeking to explore the universe, discover cures for infectious diseases, or discover ways to feed the starving masses in Africa or India. Such a preoccupation with impotent images was a device to keep the slave's aspirations in check. The persistence of such models to the exclusion of others perpetuates the conditions of slavery. Even more destructive is the person who feels the necessity to be a daily clown in his interactions with Caucasians. Many people have observed or experienced the African American member of an interracial team serving as the entertainer over lunch or at the party. Somehow, the quote unquote token African American always manages to be the funniest guy. It becomes an obsession on the part of the minority member to maintain favor with his colleagues by keeping them laughing. He often finds himself being urged, "Come on, Sam, tell us a joke." So another old pattern, with its roots in slavery, continues to bring rewards on the modern stage. Human beings are unable to be about the serious business of living and building societies if they feel compelled to always clown. People do not take you seriously if you don't take yourself seriously. A sense of humor brings necessary balance to an organized life, but a life of humor blinds one to life. Personal inferiority. Let us consider another one of the most destructive characteristics from slavery. The characteristic is a sense of our inferiority as African American people. This characteristic has been discussed by psychologists more than any other. It has been used as an explanation for nearly every aspect of African American behavior. The self-hatred or low self-esteem of African American people has probably been overworked, but is worthy of our consideration in this discussion. The shrewd slave makers were fully aware that people who still respected themselves as human beings would resist to the death the dehumanizing process of slavery. Therefore, a systematic process of creating a sense of inferiority in the proud African was necessary in order to maintain them as slaves. This was done by humiliating and dehumanizing acts such as public beatings, parading them on slave blocks unclothed, and inspecting them as though they were cattle or horses. They were forbidden to communicate with other slaves, which would have been a basis for maintaining some self-respect. Many historians and slave narratives report how young children were separated from their mothers because the mother's love might cultivate some self-respect in the child. Cleanliness and personal effectiveness are fairly essential in the maintenance of self-respect. The slaves were kept filthy, and the very nature of physical restraints over long periods of time began to develop in the people a sense of their helplessness. The loss of the ability to even clean one's body and to shield oneself from a blow began to teach the slave that he should have no self-respect. These things, combined with the insults, the loss of cultural traditions, rituals, family life, religion, and even names, served to cement the loss of self-respect. As the slave master exalted himself and enforced respect of himself, he was increasingly viewed as superior to the slaves. The superiority was based on the utter dehumanization of the Africans. The slave was forced to bow and bend to the slave owner and treat him as a god. With the image of a Caucasian man as God, and with all kinds of images of Africans as dirty and only half human, it was inevitable that a sense of inferiority would grow into the African American personality. Carter G. Woodson, 1931, observed over a half century ago, quote, "To handicap a student for life by teaching him that his black face is a curse and that his struggle to change his condition is hopeless is the worst kind of lynching. It kills one's aspirations and dooms him to vagabondage and crime." End quote. This sense of inferiority still affects us in many ways. Our inability to respect African American leadership, our persistent and futile efforts to look like and act like Caucasian people, is based upon this sense of inferiority. The persistent tendency to think of dark skin as unattractive, kinky hair as bad hair, and African features as less appealing than Caucasian features come from this sense of inferiority. Our lack of respect for African American expertise and the irresponsibility of many African American experts comes from this sense of inferiority. The disastrously high black on black homicide rate is in many ways indicative of fundamental disrespect for black life growing out of this same sense of inferiority. It is a simple fact that people who love themselves seek to preserve their lives, not destroy them. The fact that we remain as consumers and laborers, rather than manufacturers, planners, and managers, has a lot to do with the sense of inferiority. The continued portrayal of African Americans as clowns, servants, crooks, and incompetents maintains this sense of inferiority. The limited number of powerful and dignified images of African Americans in the media and the community as a whole reduces our sense of self-respect. This is a continuation of the slavery patterns. Only those persons who looked like, acted like, and thought in the framework of reference of the master were completely acceptable. Those earning such acceptance were projected as far superior to those who looked like, acted like, and thought in the frame of reference of African self-affirmation. We can reverse the destructive effects of slavery by looking to strengths in our past and beginning to make plans for our future. If we begin to direct our children's attention to strong images like themselves, they will grow in self-respect. We must honor and exalt our own heroes, and those heroes must be people who have done the most to dignify us as a people. We must seek to overcome the quote-unquote plantation ghosts by identifying with forces of enslavement and self-abasement. We must definitely avoid the psychologically destructive representation of God in a Caucasian form. We must build and maintain strong, clean, and safe communities. The ability to influence our environments in some small way is the first step toward building or restoring self-respect. Community division. The point of this discussion is that slavery had and continues to have a devastating effect on the personalities of African American people. There is much overlap and connection between these traits since they have all come out of the same situation. There is also wide variation as to the continued influence of these traits, but certainly they persist to a lesser or greater extent within ourselves and within our communities. One of the most serious disturbances of community development from the slavery period is Community division. The age-old pattern of divide and conquer was utilized with so many other tricks in order to destroy African American community life. Wedges of division were thrown among the slaves in order to ensure that the possibility for united efforts would be nearly impossible. The slave makers were fully aware that a disunited community would be easy prey for the continued control by the master. Therefore, all kinds of devices were utilized in order to make sure that the slaves would not be able to come together. There were major social divisions constructed by the master. The house workers and the field workers constituted the major separation among the slaves. Those slaves with the lesser physical load of the housework were taught by the master to see themselves as a privileged group. They were permitted to wear better clothes, eat slightly better foods, and, most importantly, they were permitted to take care of the personal needs of the master and his household. Just to be physically close to the master gave the slave a sense of superiority over his fellow slaves. Stamp, 1956, describes this phenomenon in the following way. Quote, "The slaveholder needed the willing cooperation of some of his bondsmen to make his government work efficiently. Knowing that the majority could not be trusted, he tried to recruit a few who would be loyal to him and take his side against the others. Usually he found his allies among the domestics, skilled artisans and foremen, all of whom he encouraged to feel superior to, and remain apart from, the field hands. In this manner, some planters gained the assistance of chatels who identified themselves wholly with the master class." End quote. The slaves who were the illegitimate offspring of the master were usually given greater privileges. Along with other house slaves, they were delegated authority over the field hands of the master. A tradition grew up giving those slaves with physical features like the slave masters a feeling of superiority over those slaves without such features. Stamp, 1956, again observes, quote, "But the most piteous device for seeking status in the slave community was that of boasting about the white ancestors or taking pride in a light complexion. In the eyes of the whites, the mulatto was tainted as much as the pure Negro, and as hopelessly tied to the inferior caste. But this did not prevent some slaves of mixed ancestry, not all, from trying to make their Caucasian blood serve as a mark of superiority within their own caste." End quote. Among the house slaves and field slaves, there was a constant designation and alteration of authority by the master in order to keep the community divided. Those given authority were made to believe that their welfare was dependent on the master's welfare, and that they were independent of their fellow slaves. Therefore, they worked against the development of any unity among the slaves. The slaves with certain skills, such as iron workers, blacksmiths, or carpenters, were separated from the common field hands and made to believe that they were something quite special. All of these special categories of slaves were easily pitted against one another on the basis of their special classes or skills, which prevented them from dealing with their common status as slave. Their total dependence on the slaveholder essentially sealed their fate against their effective self-development. The inevitable conflict among them almost invariably worked for the benefit of the slave masters. The slaves' energies became consumed in affirming and defending their special class membership rather than addressing their real problem, the condition of slavery. The master fostered such rivalries since such false issues effectively distracted from the real issue. Divided communities among African Americans persist. The sophistication of the classes dividing the community has improved, and the classifications have multiplied tremendously. Rather than house versus field, it is fraternities, sororities, schools, churches, white collar, blue collar, Republican, Democrat, neighborhoods, and hundreds of other bases for divisions. The root is simple, but the basis for the separation is the same. That is, to keep the community divided. The origin of all of the classes, clubs, and groups still come from the same source, an outsider who still profits from our division. Though perhaps not intentional, the divisive outcome is the same. The deeply entrenched predisposition to accept division rather than unity within our communities is one of the most deadly outcomes of slavery. Every leader or scholar who has attempted to address African American community problems poses this destructive disunity as the most deadly disease in our communities. On those fleeting occasions when African American communities have unified behind an issue, our potency as a people has been awesome. Perhaps it is the potential power of such unity which forces those who profit from the status quo to feed the disunity among African American people. One would hope that exposure of this quote unquote plantation ghost to the light of knowledge would facilitate its rapid disappearance. African Americans now, as we did 300 years ago, still spend more time justifying our separate goals than we do working on common goals. We are usually incapable of addressing our common problems because we feel that our separate problems are more important. This is another one of those constantly repeating dramas from slavery which we continue to act out because we have not understood its origin in our not so distant slavery experience. The family. Probably the most serious effect of all was the effect that slavery had on the African American family. The family is the very foundation of healthy, constructive, personal, and community life. Without a strong family, individual life and community life are likely to become very unstable. The destruction or damage to the African American was accomplished by destroying marriage, fatherhood, and motherhood. William Goodell, 1853, describes the institution of marriage as it was viewed by the slaveholders. Quote, "The slave has no rights, of course. He or she cannot have the rights of a husband, a wife. The slave is a chattel, and chattels do not marry. The slave is not ranked among sentient beings, but among things, and things are not married." End quote. Goodell continues in his graphic description of slave marriages. Quote, "The obligations of marriage are evidently inconsistent with the conditions of slavery, and cannot be performed by a slave. The husband promises to protect his wife and provide for her. The wife promises to be the helpmeet of her husband. They mutually promise to live with and cherish each other till parted by death. But what can such promises by slaves mean? The legal relation of master and slave renders them void. It forbids the slave to protect even himself. It clothes his master with authority to bid him inflict deadly blows on the woman he has sworn to protect. It prohibits his possession of any property wherewith to sustain her. It gives master unlimited control and full possession of her own person, and forbids her, on pains of death, to resist him, if he drags her to his bed, it severs the plighted pair at the will of their masters, occasionally or forever. End quote. This rather lengthy quote graphically illustrates the ultimate meaninglessness of marriage for the slave. Even under circumstances where the marriage ties were not arbitrarily violated, the very condition of slavery contradicted much about the vital and fundamental conditions of marriage. The African American man was evaluated by his ability to endure strenuous work and to produce children. He was viewed by the slave master as a stud and a workhorse. The stronger and more children he could sire, the greater the expansion of the master's slave holdings, and the greater was his financial worth. The more work the slave could perform, the greater the production, the greater were the profits that came to the master. African American manhood was defined by the ability to impregnate a woman and the degree of his physical strength. The virtues of being able to protect, support, and provide for one's offspring, which is the cornerstone of true fatherhood, was not considered the mark of a man. In fact, the slave who sought to assert such rights for his offspring was likely to be branded as a troublemaker and either punished or killed. After several generations of such unnatural treatment, the African American man adapted and began to avoid the role of a true father. Today, in African American communities around America, we carry the mark of the strong-armed stud from slavery. He occurs as the modern-day pimp or the man who delights in leaving neglected babies dispersed around town. He is the man who feels that he is a man only by his physical, violent, or sexual exploits. He leaves welfare or chance to father his children, and he fathers his quote-unquote ride, his vines, or his pad. This peculiar behavior is often characterized as a racial trait, attributable to some type of moral weakness in African American people. Such conclusions fail to identify the real origin of such traits. Such family irresponsibility does not occur among African people who have not endured the ravages of slavery. The African American woman was valued primarily as a breeder or sexual receptacle to show the capacity to have healthy children. Again, Goodell, 1853, offers an example of a newspaper advertisement for an African woman which demonstrates the desirable qualities of the slave woman. Quote, a girl about 20 years of age, raised in Virginia, and her two female children, one 4 and the other 2 years old, is remarkably strong and healthy, never having had a day's sickness, with the exception of the smallpox in her life. The children are fine and healthy. She is very prolific in her generating qualities and affords a rare opportunity to any person who wishes to raise a family of healthy servants for their own use. End quote. Her work as a human being was reduced to the particular financial value of personal pleasure she could hold for the master. As a breeder, she was to be mated with the plantation's strongest studs regardless of human attachment. She was also usually expected to be receptive to the sexual exploitation of the slave master. Goodell, 1853, documents this point. Quote, forced concubinage of slave women with their masters and overseers, often coerced by the lash, constituted another class of facts, equally undesirable. Rape committed on a female slave is an offense not recognized by law. End quote. Such abuse of the African American woman began to damage the natural nurturance, and dignity of motherhood. Children were conceived out of convenience for an oppressor, not even at the level of animal lust. The child was doomed to continue in the very conditions which had bred him. Many women either became abusive to their children or overprotective of them in response to such inhuman conditions. Even today, we find too many frustrated young African American women choosing to become breeders in their search for an identity. Too many of those young mothers become abusers of those children or turn them into delicate pimps by indulgently protecting them against a cruel world. The massive confusion around sexual identity so often addressed in the African American media and periodicals has its foundation in the conditions of slavery. Men seeking to be men through physical exploits, sexual exploits, or even deviation is predictable in a setting where natural avenues to manhood have been systematically blocked. Women will experience inevitable frustration of their natural feminine aspirations when the paths to womanhood have been blocked. The historical images which we have inherited continue to sabotage many of our efforts for true manhood, fatherhood, and womanhood, motherhood. In nature and throughout the historical development of cultured people, the roles of man and father, woman and mother have been inextricably bound. Only in instances of decaying culture, such as ancient Greece, Rome, and modern Euro-America, has this bond been broken. With its break has come family dissolution, followed closely by total societal dissolution. Though current attitudes and conditions, such as unemployment, feed these patterns and keep them growing, the origins of the African American family problems rest in the plague of slavery. If we understand these historical routines and patterns, then perhaps we can try to avoid continuing to play them. Color consciousness. In concluding this discussion on the psychological effects of slavery, we would like to address another destructive characteristic from this experience. This slavery effect is a color consciousness which is older than slavery but found its real rooting for the African American during slavery. Color consciousness is the unnatural assignment of mental or moral traits based upon physical skin color. These traits can be either positive or negative, as long as the basis is assumed to be in skin color. Of course, the very condition of the Africans' slavery was done on the basis of skin color. The failure of Caucasians and Native Americans to endure the physical abuse of involuntary servitude led to the enslavement of the African. The contradiction that slavery presented for the supposedly quote-unquote Christian nation led to the justification of slavery as a divinely authorized activity. The African's black skin was considered as evidence for his cursed state to serve as a slave. Some obscure Bible allegory regarding the curse of Ham was used to justify the inhuman treatment of the African who was wrongly assumed to be the descendant of Ham. So dark skin color became equated with the reason for slavery. The skin color of the slave became associated with other kinds of subhuman traits. On the other hand, the slave master's pale skin became equated with superhuman traits. In fact, God, all the saints, and the entire heavenly host became identified with the pale skin. The logical conclusion of the abused, oppressed slave was that the basis for his condition was his skin color, and the way out of his condition was to change that color. This deeply ingrained idea has persisted. Even today, there is an unnatural equation of Caucasian physical features with beauty, intelligence, authority, and so forth. A disproportionate number of professional, educated, and so-called beautiful African Americans have prominently Caucasian features. There are still vast sums of money spent yearly on skin lighteners, hair straighteners, and wigs in the frantic effort to change African American physical features. Good hair and nice features are still thought to be those characteristics most like Caucasians. Contrary to popular belief, these attitudes have not changed substantially among African American youth who have grown up since the Black Power movement of the 1960s. Following the social movements of the 60s, another limb grew on the color consciousness tree. There was an effort to equate African American physical features with mental and moral superiority. The same sick mind that had made black inferior and white superior was evident in the effort to make black superior and white inferior. The limited perspective, which limits the human makeup to its physical surface hue, is equally limited regardless of perspective. One scholar has stated that, quote, "He who remains ignorant of history is doomed to repeat history." End quote. Certainly, the persistence of our psychological, social, and economic dependence on the former slaveholders is evidence of the validity of this adage. The intensity and brutality of the slave-making expertise traumatized our social and human development. Though many writers have spoken of slavery, few scholars have addressed the continuity of the slavery experience within our psychology. The one exception is probably Stanley Elkins, 1968, who developed a sociological thesis that argued that the closed nature of North American slavery, in contrast to Latin American slavery, produced a quote-unquote Sambo-type personality in the slave. The Sambo was described by Elkins as, quote, "docile but irresponsible, loyal but lazy, humble but chronically given to lying and stealing. His behavior was full of infantile silliness and his talk inflated with childish exaggeration. His relationship with his master was one of utter dependence and childlike attachment." End quote. The problem with Elkins' analysis of the black personality while identifying a possible outcome of slavery, he consumed his analysis into this single image. Our suggestion is of much more complexity, but a similar recognition that the slavery situation produced some persisting personality traits. The reader might inquire, with considerable basis, that if this discussion is correct, then the African American personality has been devastated. One would expect the obvious taint of this humanly demoralizing experience to have affected all aspects and all members of this community. But in fact, the vast majority of African Americans operate with considerable efficiency and are generally no more severely disordered than are the people who were historically the perpetrators rather than victims of these conditions. The fact that despite slavery, such functioning is the rule speaks to two factors which space will not permit adequate development in this discussion. The first factor is the apparent strength of character, culture, and heritage that African people apparently brought to America's plantations. Other peoples have degenerated in their fundamental humanity under conditions of stress far less intense and enduring than those experienced by African people. Research needs to identify the elements of that African character which might serve as a model for human strength in general. The second factor is that the survival of the fundamental human initiative among African Americans, despite over 300 years of the most inhuman conditions ever experienced by any people in the current historical epoch, is indicative of human resilience. Despite the lingering vestiges which we have described in this discussion, recovery has been substantial. The triumphs of America's former slaves far exceeds the deficits attributed to us. African American people exist more as a monument of human accomplishment than the remains of human destruction. However, the fact remains, the quote-unquote plantation ghost still haunts us. Our progress is still impeded by many of the slavery-based characteristics which we have described above. The objective of the discussion is not to parade deficits from a causative source, but to unveil the foundation which supports some faulty caricatures which revelation should uproot. Neither is this discussion an effort to underestimate the severity and barbarity of the continued economic and social exploitation of America's former slaves. It is to call our attention to an array of attitudes, habits, and behaviors which clearly follow a direct lineage to slavery. It is hoped that by shining the light of awareness on these dark recesses of our past, we can begin to conquer the ghosts which continue to haunt our personal and social lives. We can begin to move beyond the shackles of restricted human growth that have bound us since that kidnapping of not so long ago.